Okay, so I think we'll get started here. We have almost a little over 80 participants. Welcome to the third meeting of the Fairbanks Center's Modern China Lecture Series. My name is Arunab Ghosh. I teach modern Chinese history here in the history department. Before I introduce our esteemed speaker of the day, I just wanted to remind everyone of our final event this fall. In 2 weeks, we will host, on November 10th, in 2 weeks, we will host Covell Meiskens from the Naval Postgraduate School, and he'll be delivering a talk titled Mao's Massive Military Industrial Campaign to Defend Cold War China. So this is drawing from his recently published book on the Third Front during the 60s and 1970s. I think, actually I can post it on chat right now. The link is already active, and you can, I just posted it on chat, so you can find information about that talk online, and please register and join us in 2 weeks. Okay, so today I'm delighted to welcome Professor Fei-Hsien Wang, who will be delivering a talk entitled Everybody Loves Qianlong, Vernacular Fantasies, Cultural Consumption, and the Prosperous Age in Post-Imperial China. Fei-Hsien teaches in the history department at Indiana University, Bloomington. She is a historian of modern China with interests in how information, ideas, and practices were produced, transmitted, and consumed across different societies, not just in China, but broadly across East Asia. And a lot of her recent research has focused on the relationship between knowledge, commerce, and political authority from the 1800s onwards. She received her PhD in 2012 from the University of Chicago, and before that received her undergraduate education from National Zhengzhou University in Taipei in Taiwan. Her most recent publication, well, actually her most recent major publication, she has had articles since, but her most recent major publication was the book Pirates and Publishers, A Social History of Copyright in Modern China, which I'm sure many of you have already read. It came out last year, published by Princeton University Press, which is, as the title suggests, it's the fascinating history of copyright, how it was understood, appropriated, codified, and then sort of practiced as a new legal doctrine. I think she spans the late Qing, the final few decades of the Qing, all the way up to the first decade of the People's Republic of China. She's now working on a new project, which examines what she says, commonly seen but rarely discussed motif of empire or diguo in Chinese popular culture from the late Qing to the present. And we will be hearing more about that project in the talk today, I imagine. Before I hand things over to Fei-Hsien, just a few words about format. Fei-Hsien will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll follow that with a Q&A session of roughly the same duration. So we'll try and finish by about 5:30 or thereabouts. If you have questions, and you're free to start doing this during the talk itself, you're welcome to use the Q&A function within Zoom and write up your questions. I would request you to identify yourself if you can, but at the same time, we are recording. So if you're not comfortable doing so, that's also perfectly fine. You're welcome to stay anonymous. Okay, so without any further ado, let me hand things over to Professor Wang.
So am I sharing the screen all right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you for the invitation and kind introduction. It's really nice to be back to Harvard and talk about vernacular myths and popular fantasies about Emperor Qianlong in China in the past 150 years. So let me see. Okay, so Emperor Qianlong, 爱新觉罗弘历, was the 6th emperor of the Qing. He reigned the empire from 1735 to 1796. Under his over 60 years reign, the Qing Empire reached its peak. It's the geopolitical and economic social superpower in its time. Qianlong's reign was an era of splendor and prosperity, as well as the pinnacle of imperial autocracy in China. Emperor Qianlong also has been one of the most popular and talked about historical figures in China. Hundreds of local delicacies and crafts claim that they have been endorsed by the emperor during his extensive imperial tours, as if Qianlong's tastes still hold a certain gold standard. Various merchandise were named after him in recent years. Palace museums in Beijing and Taipei gained significant profit by selling Qianlong-themed products. Not to mention that he has been the protagonist or the ultimate villain in countless popular novels, unofficial history, plays, TV series, and films. And he is one of the cases I study in my new project. This new project, tentatively entitled Phantoms of Empire, explores the long-lasting trend in China's vibrant culture consumption of fantasizing the imperial past of China and other countries from the last day of the Qing to the present. By examining the presence of the imperial motif in Sinophone popular culture, I hope to capture China's prolonged and entangled departure from its imperial past. Qianlong would be an ideal case for this new project, not only because he left rich materials for popular imaginations, but also because his reign was the last and most familiar prosperous age of shengshi of China for modern Chinese. He is a reminder of China's primacy in the world. And for many Chinese, Qianlong's reign may be the unspoken default condition they think the country ought to return to one day. Yet at the same time, Qianlong was also an embodiment of the imperial past that the modern Chinese state was created to overcome. So in this talk, I will trace the segmentary formation of the vernacular myths and popular fantasies about Emperor Qianlong. As China's culture, economy, and political climate transformed over time, new stories about Qianlong emerged to satisfy the changing desire of the audiences as well as the political authorities. These cultural products have gradually shaped a common historical memory that take the place of Qing history in most Chinese minds, despite generations of specialist effort to debunk it. At the core of the vernacular fantasies of Emperor Qianlong, I argue, lies the unsolved tension between modern Han Chinese nationalism and the legacy of a non-Han imperial prosperous age. Although there are countless serious stories and unofficial histories about Qianlong produced and untold and retold in different genres in a variety of media in the past century, they were mostly revolving around the following intertwined motifs and themes: his birth, his romance, his power and the power and prosperity of the empire during his time, and his extensive southern tours. The variations of these various motifs could be seen as different strategies or attempts the Chinese developed to discuss and or reconcile with the tension between the longing and desire for a great China and the problem of Qianlong being imperial and Manchu. Most of this basic element of popular Qianlong myths and fantasies could be traced back to mid-19th century in oral traditions such as storytelling, shoshu, or as anecdotes in anthologies, commentary, and poetry. In the last year of the Qing, as anti-Manchu sentiment on the rise and as the Qing authority declined and eventually collapsed, these Qianlong anecdotes and rumors were gradually woven into a more coherent and comprehensive vernacular history of the Qing monarchy, which was packed of sensational sex scandal, bloody sabotages among siblings, and among other terrible things. We see the first surge of such titles, mostly published in Shanghai by commercial publishers in the 1910s, especially between 1914 and 1916. Titles such as 满清外史、清史译文、清宫13朝演义 or 清朝野史大观, like the Ansong region forbidden bestsellers Robert Dunton studied. Those unofficial history of Qing were mostly fantasies and slender in guise of secret history to satisfy the early Republic readers' curiosity. At the same time, they reflect the change in Chinese public sentiments from discontent with the Manchu monarchy to disgust with it. The unofficial history collectively tells a story of how High Qing jewelers were a promiscuous clan with no low morality. Since the 1930s, there are serious historians such as Meng Sen have been trying very hard to push back those popular myths, as they have been now seen by many as the real history of the Qing. So the first core element in the vernacular fantasy about Qianlong is his birth. According to official records, Qianlong was born in Beijing in 1711 by Emperor Yongzhen's consort, Niuhulu. However, in most popular unofficial histories and stories, Lady Niuhulu was not Qianlong's real mother. He was allegedly born by a Han Benan maiden, Emperor Yongzheng raped in Rehe, or by a certain low-ranking Han consort or maid. Another widespread version is that Qianlong was actually a son of the Chens of High Qing, who got swapped with Lady Niuhulu's daughter. The shared motif of these alternative realities is the claim that Qianlong, the most accomplished emperor of the Qing, was not Manchu, but half Han or 100% Han. This could be seen as one way for the Han Chinese audience to reconcile with the non-Han Prosperous age. If it's created by one of us, then it's okay to claim it as Chinese. Another main theme of Qianlong's fantasy is his colorful relationship with all kinds of women. Qianlong is well known for his devotion to Lady Fucha, his first empress. They loved each other. Their 20 years marriage was happy. He wrote many poems to mourn her after her untimely death at the age of 36. However, Emperor Qianlong also had a huge harem and allegedly had many affairs outside of the palace. Among the stories of his consorts, the most well-known one may be the tragedy of Xiang Fei, the fragrant concubine, a wicked woman sent to the palace. Qianlong fell in love with her stunning beauty, but she wanted to kill the emperor to revenge for her husband and her fellow tribalmen. After a failed assassination attempt, she committed suicide. As James Newell's study on seven concubines argues, her introduction to the palace serves as an allegory for the incorporation of Xinjiang into the Qing Empire and later the Chinese state. Along the same line, her refusal to submit to the emperor could be seen as a symbol of resistance. Similar allegory could be observed in Qianlong's other romances, such as the rumor that he made a daughter of the Kongs of Qi, descendant of the Confucius, his secret mistress, or his affair with the #1 courtesan in Suzhou, the cultural pivot of China proper. However, the flip side of Qianlong being a sexual counter is that he was also a brutal womanizer. For example, rumor has that he had an affair with the wife of Fu-Hen, who was not only an important minister of Qin, but also Lady Fucha's younger brother. And Fu-Hen's son, Fu Kangan, was in fact Qianlong's black child. In one version of the story, Lady Fucha was so heartbroken by this affair that she committed suicide. This reinforced the grand narrative that the Icing Generals or the Manchus were promiscuous. Many other popular stories about Qianlong are associated with his southern tour. Throughout his reign, Qianlong had 6 imperial tours from Beijing to Jiangnan. These massive operations are display to the Han population, the dynastic interests and the emperor's personal authority. Well, these tours have various important military, economic, and cultural purposes. In Vernacular Fantasies, the Emperor Qianlong embarked such tours mainly for personal reasons. In some versions, the real purpose of the southern tour is to seek his Han roots, for example, repeating visits to the Chen in High Qing. In popular literature, Qianlong liked to disguise himself in Jiangnan as Han gentleman, and basically did the following 4 things: eating, flirting, getting lost, and punish bad guys or corrupt officials. This plot of Qianlong disguise himself and punish bad guys could be traced back to a popular novel entitled 圣朝鼎盛万年经, the Prosperous Holy Dynasty Evergreen, which was first published between 1870s and 1880s. This intriguingly could be seen as a pro-Qing narrative to counter an earlier anti-Manchu story, the legend of Xilu 传说, and its offspring Evergreen 万年经. So the story goes as follows. The monk of Southern Shaolin Temple helped the Qing to conquer a place called Xilu. But then they were betrayed by the Qing and got suppressed. The pupils of the Shaolin monks then became martial art masters and warriors. They punish corrupt and abusive Manchu officials and bring justice to the society. However, in this counter anti-Manchu version, The people of the Sounding Monks were the bad guys, caused disarray, and it was Qianlong and his entourage who punished those troublemakers and brought back social order. In 1910,圣朝鼎圣万年经 was republished, renamed as Qianlong Xia Jiangnan, Qianlong Southern Tour, and since then has become a staple of classical Qianlong fantasy. Between the 1950s and early 1980s, we see another surge of popular fantasy. There were many created by Chinese authors, journalists, filmmakers who relocate to Hong Kong and Taiwan after 1949. Their works were widely circulated in the Sinophone world outside of China during the Cold War, but later also became available for mainland audience after the 1980s. While there are some updated versions of classical Qianlong stories, such as novelist Gao Yang's Qianlong Yunshi, The Romance of Qianlong, there are also intriguing new diasporic reappropriation of Qianlong fantasies. These authors and filmmakers took the opportunity to describe Qianlong southern tours and military campaign, to express certain nostalgia to a splendor rich but lost mainland and Chinese culture. Readers find details. Yes.
Just a second. Sorry to interrupt you. I think there is some static being created for our listeners because of maybe the paper being very close to the mic.
Oh, sorry.
So if you could hold this paper away, so because people we're getting messages from people. So sorry for the interruption again.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Okay. And so in this new stories, reader find detailed and lengthy description of the landscape, national site, historical sites, and local customs and delicacies, for example, xiaorou or dumplings. They also approach the Han-Manchu tension in a more cynical way by asking whether the Han, the good guys who believe in justice and morality, should or could work with the Manchus or the bad guys who subscribe to a different political ideology to make China greater and safe. And one readers often find plots involved in conflicts with other ethnic minority or border conflicts in Xinjiang and Tibet. So let me use two examples to illustrate this new diasporic reimagination of Emperor Qianlong. First, Jin Yong Su Jian En Chong Lu, The Book and the Sword. Jin Yong, native name Zha Liangyong, was a journalist and martial art novelist in Hong Kong. He was also a descendant of the scholarly Cha family of Haining. The Book and Sword was first published in 1955 and then republished in multiple times in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and mainland China. It has at least 7 TV adaptations and 3 film versions. Built on 2 Qianlong myths, him being a son of the Chens of Haining and the legend of fragrant concubine. The story is about the love triangle between Qianlong, who was actually a Han, and his biological brother Chen Jialuo, who was also the leader of an anti-Manchu Red Flower Society, and the Hui Princess, the fragrant princess, Ka's lead. It's also about the agreement between Chen and Qianlong to restore China to the Han, and the alliance between the Red Flower Society and the Huis against the Qing oppression. Chen Jialuo was willing to work with Qianlong and even give up fragrant princess for the greater Han revival cause. But Qianlong, as a selfish villain, betrayed not only the Aixin jewelers who brought him up, but also his biological Han brother and caused the death of fragrant princess. At the end of the story, the heartbroken protagonist gave up his Confucian learning and anti-Manchu mission. He went into exile in today's Xinjiang and considered to convert to Islam. Another example I would like to share is Li Hanxiang's Qianlong series. Li Hanxiang is maybe one of the most productive and popular film directors in Cold War Sinophone world, most famous for his period drama. In late 1970s and early 1980s, he directed 4 films about Qianlong for the Shaw Brothers studio, loosely based on the Southern Tour stories I discussed earlier. These are entertaining and somewhat cynical comedies about Qianlong and his entourage's wild adventures in Jiangnan. In this series, Qianlong disguised as a rich Han gentleman wandering around Yangzhou and Suzhou, but he appeared to be ignorant about local customs and had to constantly seek advice. Through his conversation with the tea house clerk and barber, audiences are reminded of the delicious snack, vibrant marketplaces of Jiangnan. However, Li also wants to make a point that the so-called anti-Manchu activists were ignorant about the Manchu court how the Manchu court functioned. For example, in the film Qianlong Xia Yangzhou, The Voyage of Emperor Qianlong, Qianlong was kidnapped by a group of anti-Manchu activists. Then there is a 10-minute scene of Qianlong explaining how his father, Emperor Yongzheng, cannot alter the succession edict because the court is multilingual. In 1983, Li Hanxiang was invited by China Film Production Corporation, 中国电影合作制作公司, to direct a film called 火烧圆明园, The Burning of Imperial Palace. Finally, he can film his beloved Qing period drama on location in Beijing. Owing to the reform and opening up throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Hong Kong and Taiwanese production companies co-produce with their Chinese counterparts an impressive amount of period dramas, many about Qianlong. Such co-production arrangement allow Hong Kong and Taiwanese companies to film on location at low cost and enter the emerging Chinese entertainment market. This period drama showcased the splendid summer palace and the magnificent landscape of Inner Mongolia to Hong Kong and Taiwanese audience who previously only read about them in books. At the same time, they also reintroduced Emperor Qianlong to the mainland audience, not as an evil, fat feudal oppressor, but as a handsome, funny dandy, a personable human being. The most successful Qianlong-themed TV series in the Sinophone world during this period must be 还珠格格, Return of Pearl Return of Pearl Princess. It's a brainchild of Taiwan-based novelist and TV producer Chong Yao, who is best known for her tearjerker romances. Return of Pearl Princess is a cultural phenomenon in the late 1990s China. Allegedly, more than half of the Chinese population watched it when the first season premiered in 1998. It may still hold the record of being the most watched TV drama in Chinese history. As I argue elsewhere, Chong Yao might be inspired by the CC trilogy of the 1950 films about the Empress Elizabeth of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that became very popular in China in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Echoing CC trilogy's themes, Return of Pearl Princess introduced Chinese audience a freedom-loving people's princess and portrayed Qianlong as a caring and largely lovable father. The Qing's territorial expansion became the backdrop of the protagonist's adventure and their friendship with Tibetan, Uyghur, and even Burma princesses. So, the Return of Pearl Princess is about the adventure of this two young girl, Xiao Yanzi, Little Swallow, a traveling martial art performer, and Ziwei, a talented beauty who is a love child of Qianlong. The two attempt to approach the emperor during one of his southern tours so that Ziwei can fulfill her late mother's wish and reunited with her birth father. However, it got messed up. Little Swallow was misidentified as the lost princess, and Ziwei, in order to accompany Little Swallow back to the Forbidden City, has to pretend to be her maid. The first season is mainly about these two young girls' experience in the Manchu palace, and how they and their newly found lovers try to fix the swap identity. Emperor Qianlong was fond of Little Swallow as she is an authentic free spirit. but others, such as the step empresses and her evil wet nurse Rong Momo, consider her and Ziwei too vulgar and lack discipline. Many highlights in season 1 are Little Swallow's comical learning process to become a princess. Imperial splendor and material enjoyments were introduced to the audience through Little Swallow's perspective as a commoner. While Qianlong and the audience have a great laugh at her straightforward and sometimes silly resistance against the imperial rules. A remark on how those rules are pretentious and inhumane could also be seen as a modern critique to the hypocritical feudal imperial authorities. What you see, what you see here is a typical example. Several of the core themes and motifs of Qianlong fantasy are reinvented in Return of Pearl Princess to yield a happy ending for everyone. We see the motif of the promiscuous Aishin in season 1, when the main characters almost commit incest. Qianlong's son Yongqi falls in love with the little swallow, who is his nominal sibling. And at one point, Qianlong also expressed his interest of making Ziwei his consort. Luckily, such moral crisis is resolved after the true identity of the two girls are revealed. In season 2, the fragrant concubine escaped from her tragic fate as Little Swallow, and Ziwei helped her leave the palace and reunited with her lover secretly. In the second half of the season 2, Little Swallow found her biological brother, an anti-Manchu swordsman. As it turns out, Emperor Qianlong was the murderer of Little Swallow's parents. However, after observing the affection between Little Swallow and Qianlong, the brother decides to keep the secret from her little sister so that she doesn't need to confront this ultimate moral dilemma. In 1999, before Chinese audience can watch the second season of Return of Pearl Princess, another blockbuster Qing period drama was aired. This time in China's national TV station, the CCTV. Yongzheng Wangchao, Yongzheng Dynasty is based on Yue He's novel. It focused on the court struggles, anti-corruption, and concentration of power during the reigns of Qianlong's grandfather, Emperor Kangxi, and his father, Emperor Yongzheng. It became the most watched CCTV drama of the all time and won almost all the possible TV awards in China that year. The success of Yongzheng Dynasty marks the beginning of a new era for Qing period drama after it was endorsed by the PRC leader, such as Jiang Zemin. Premier Zhu Rongji was reportedly moved to tears by Emperor Yongzheng's tireless effort to reform the Qing bureaucracy. Audience also found Yongzheng Dynasty very relevant to their own experience. They saw many parallels between High Qing and the late 20th century China. Qing thus became an allegory for contemporary China. The Iron Blood Premier Zhu Rongji was compared with the Iron Blood Emperor Yongzheng. For many people who are critical to the regime, such as Liu Xiaopo, the official endorsement of Yongzheng Dynasty testified the party leadership's authoritarian, if not imperial nature. Once such allegory was established and acknowledged, the Qing period drama in China could no longer be pure entertainment. They could be read or overread as commentary of the current regime. Owing to the great success of Yongzheng Dynasty throughout the 2000s, we see a new surge of Qing drama and novels about the three great Qing emperors. However, the audience reaction toward these new fantasies are not fully under the control of the regime, and they cause unforeseen problems, especially for the increasingly sensitive National Radio and Television Administration, 广电总局. So these are some of the unforeseen developments. Well, there is a sequel of Yongzheng Dynasty on Emperor Qianlong. The viral TV series about Emperor Qianlong in the 2000s is this one, 铁齿铜牙纪晓岚, the adequate 纪晓岚series. This series, like an earlier similar comedy, Grand Chancellor Hunchback Liu, 宰相刘罗锅, is following the tradition of the Han Xiang's Qianlong's adventure in Jiangnan. But now the story of Emperor Qianlong and his ministers and this battle of wits is retold under the banner of anti-corruption. However, the character who won the audience hearts in this series was the ultimate corrupt official of the Qing, Fei-Hsien. Many audience consider him the real role model. As one comment says, quote, if you want to survive in the organization, you need to learn how Fei-Hsien interact with Emperor Qianlong, unquote. Another unforeseen aftermath of Yongzheng Dynasty is that Chinese audiences, especially female audiences, project their romantic affection to Emperor Yongzheng and fantasize about traveling back to Qing to meet him or his siblings and enjoy imperial splendor. It gave the rise of a subgenre in Chinese internet literature called Qingchuan, literally means traveling back to Qing genre. The popularity of the Qingchuan genre is worrisome sign for the region. It indicates A, the belief that living in the imperial past is happier. B, a desire to escape from contemporary communist dominate China. National Radio and Television Administration eventually have to ban such time travel plot, saying it, quote, disrespects history, unquote. The third and probably a more dangerous new development in popular cultural production about Qing history may be the rise of the so-called power struggle genre, gongdou. In short, power struggle fictions and dramas are about the harem, how imperial consorts sabotage each other, compete for emperor's love, and give birth to male heirs while killing other people's sons. As many cultural observers have pointed out in China, when public discussion about high politics may be restricted, such power struggle genres become a substitute for political drama. The harem is a mirror image of various hierarchical organizations in China, big corporation, the government, and the Communist Party. In that case, depicting the harem of the Qing emperors as a brutal battleground of power-hungry, ruthless woman who wanted to climb up to the top of a hierarchy could be read as a negative commentary to the current party state. It was in this context Qianlong's harem became a political problem for the PRC, especially after the current regime expressed its geopolitical ambition more explicitly and after Chinese and foreign mass media start to directly or indirectly compare Xi Jinping with Emperor Qianlong. The tension between modern Chinese nationalism and the legacy of Qianlong's prosperous reign remain. But now it's less about Qianlong being a Manchu, but him being imperial. Two of the three most successful TV series in 2018, for example, revolve around Emperor Qianlong, or precisely speaking, her harem. It's his harem. Yanxi Gongyue, story of Yanxi Palace. It's about the story of Yingluo, how she ruthlessly climbed up to the stair of harem hierarchy, from a maid to the rank of noble consort. First to investigate her sister's mysterious death, and then to revenge for her master and mentor, Lady Fucha. Along the way, she won the heart of Emperor Qianlong, loosely based on the story of noble consort Ling Fei, and Emperor Jiaqing's mother. The story of Yanxi Palace was streamed more than 15 billion times when it premiered in iQIYI. Ruyi Zhuan, Ruyi's royal love in the palace, is the sequel of the palace struggle blockbuster 后宫甄嬛传, Empresses in the Palace. It's about the story of Qianlong's step-empress Ulanala, how her love toward the emperor was consumed over time by his distrust, and the endless harem sabotages against her. Disillusioned and heartbroken, she made a big quarrel with the emperor, cut her hair, which was considered as an unacceptable offense for the Manchus, and technically divorced the emperor. Premiered in Tencent video 腾讯视频. It was streamed more than 7.5 billion times. They quickly made their way to the regional TV station, but in late January 2019, they vanished from TV screens around the country. Both were suddenly taken off air after state-owned newspaper Beijing Daily accused such drama of being, quote, incompatible with the core socialist values, unquote. Their scenes, according to this editorial, were that they made a fetish of imperial lifestyle and idealized emperors and officials of the feudal past. About a month ago, on September 27, 2020, a few days before the National Day, these two dramas were further taken off from the online streaming platform, and now they are unavailable for Chinese audience in China. So how are these two most recent popular Qianlong fantasy incompatible with the core socialist values? First of all, these two dramas satisfy Chinese audience appetite for the over-the-top imperial extravaganza. The settings and the costumes are extremely lavish. To create a sense of authenticity, both production teams make great effort to replicate imperial gowns, accessories, even dishes. They introduce and highlight some of the less known Manchu customs, such as the triple earrings you see in this slide. However, many of these details are derived from the publicity campaign and commercialization initiative of the Museum Palace in recent years to make Emperor Qianlong chic and cute for contemporary museum goers. For example, Emperor Qianlong's obsession with stamping seal on his collection has been highlighted in the Palace Museum and then depicted in the story of Yanxi Palace to create a sense of historical authenticity. But then there is more than that. All this imperial extravaganza the audience see in these two dramas can be purchased if they have money. Yanxi Palace all of a sudden became a popular site in the Forbidden City. The Palace Museum sells imperial-themed lipsticks and stamps of Qianlong. On Taobao, the shopping website, one can order replica of the accessory, dresses, and hairpins of the imperial consuls they see in these two dramas. However, such merchandise exists and soaring indicate a considerable desire and demand of the imperial style to be fulfilled. These two dramas producers are fully aware that Emperor Qianlong's harem is politically sensitive, and they were very cautious about the plot. They made some conscious decision on how to portray Qianlong's multi-ethnic harem safely in order to pass the content review. For example, in Rui's royal love in the palace, while the Mongolian consuls and their influence are stressed, the stable, fragrant concubine story is told in an obscure fashion. The image you see on the right is the image of Imperial Consul Han Xiangjian, later Consul Rong. She is not depicted as a Uyghur, as it should be, but now she is from a fictional Han tribe or freezing tribe, and she dresses like a Central Asian Russian doll. Praises for Qianlong's imperial magnificence could easily be read as a nostalgia for feudal past. That's a criticism of socialist revolution, or even worse, a sign that many want the People's Republic of China to become a new empire. But Another potential and fatal problem is how this two-period drama portray the heroine of Emperor Qianlong, especially if we take the Qing as an allegory of the present PRC. So what you see here is a hierarchy of the heroine and also some sort of social network analysis of all the contours. In major contours appear in one of the drama. So in both the story of Yanxi Palace and Rui's royal love in the palace, consorts form factions and alliances to survive or to beat their rivals. The winner of the game are often not the most virtuous consort, but the most ruthless and clever ones. In both stories, we see consorts compete for the emperor's attention, not for love, but for power and leverage. And those who really devote themselves to the emperor end up died heartbrokenly. As the protagonist Yingluo remarked to Qianlong in the story of Yanxi Palace, he was just like a big pig tartar, 大猪蹄子. Every woman in the harem wants to have a bite of it because he is the only source of power. In Rui's royal love in the palace, Qianlong is further portrayed as a good emperor but a terrible husband because he's erratic, moody, paranoid, jealous, unfaithful, and most importantly, selfish. Is this a criticism toward the current regime or reader? For the National Radio and TV Administration reviewers, maybe there is no such thing as reading too much into the popular fantasies about Emperor Qianlong, the Qing, or China's imperial past. But for some Chinese audience, the authority are being paranoid and overly sensitive and stupid. As this online comment post on Weibo on September 28th, 2020, about a month ago, when the topic Rui's royal love in palace has been taken off, become the top 1 hot search trend in Weibo. We may not be able to see any new Qing period drama aired in China anytime soon, especially given the fact that it will soon be 2021, the centennial of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. But the fascination with Emperor Qianlong is not disappearing, it's just being suppressed. And the tension between the modern Han Chinese nationalism and the imperial legacy of prosperity remain unsolved. And I will stop here, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions.
Great, thank you so much, Fei-Hsien. That was really, really fascinating. Hopefully, we'll start getting questions. But I thought maybe I could start off by just asking you your reflections on one thing that I thought was very interesting. The only time in so many of the images and so many of the plays and the TV dramas and the movies that you talk about, that 1793 came up was in the foreign publication, in The Economist, yes. Right? So I was wondering if you can reflect on sort of the ways in which that legacy plays out in very different, it is a legacy as far as Western understandings of the Qing and Western understandings of China are still constructed in some ways as being sort of the defining moment. Whereas, as you are discovering, as far as an internal audience in China is concerned, there's so much else to actually be interested about, obsessed about even, about Qianlong. So I was wondering what your thoughts on that kind of sort of, the persistence of that kind of odd dichotomy is in some ways.
Yeah, I would say that like we do see similarities between the Western media portrayal and the Chinese public sentiment regarding like the rise of China now, or the returning of China to the global power vis-a-vis the High Qing. But there are like certain differences in their in their emphasis on like why Emperor Qianlong. And for most of the Chinese audiences, the early Qianlong is the part that they fascinated about. But in most of the Western media, it seems that like this is an allegory to reinforce the idea that China being authoritarian and oppressive. But interestingly, like now both popular discussions about like the similarity or the parallel between Xi and Emperor Qianlong. They were all avoiding like the later years of Qianlong, which is like once you reach the pivot and then you start to decline. And that's the part that like you can see like why the Chinese audience and the Chinese popular media producer will consciously avoid. But you see such comparison more explicitly in Western media. But you see this motif like reoccur again and again in a very ambivalent and indirect way in Chinese netizens discussion.
Great, yeah, no, that's really interesting. So I would the Q&A, just to let the audience know, the Q&A session we're well into it. So please feel free and type up your questions, and I'll read them out to Fei-Hsien and to the rest of the audience, and we can have a discussion. So we welcome questions at this stage. So as we wait for questions to come, maybe you can talk a little bit also about where this particular part of your research fits into the larger book project. So as we wait for questions, you can maybe
so this is a good question, right? So this project emerged by accident, and ideally, like this would be one of the chapters of the book. So the idea is I'm going to examine different cases. Some are fantasies about China's own imperial past, and some are Chinese fantasies of foreign imperial past. But like I'm yet to decide what are the cases I'm going to include in my book. But like the Emperor of Qing would definitely play an important part in this book.
Okay, great. So we have a question that's just come in from Meng Jiang, who says, thanks for this super interesting lecture, Fei-Hsien. The 20th century is certainly a departure from the previous imperial period, but I wonder if you see any commonalities between the post-imperial fantasies about Qianlong and previous fantasies, fictions, rumors about the royalties of a fallen dynasty, like Ming era fantasies or Sung dynasty emperors. So yeah, if you were to situate the obsession with the Qing vis-a-vis other sort of imperial.
Yeah, so yes, there are like similarities that one can observe. And because like following the traditional dynastic cycle narrative, like one dynasty fallen, as many caused by the degeneration of the moral of the emperor. So there was like the rumors about the Hurons are always a popular topic. But I think what is interesting, particularly interesting in Qing's case, is that a lot of late and early Republic fantasies and unofficial history about the Qing monarchy focus on how immoral the Manchus were. And so if you read like early Republic like publication of unofficial Qing history, like basically like every emperor, every empresses of High-Qing, they had extensive affairs with other people, and like there is no like sibling love, no filial piety whatsoever, and so I think this is like in a way some sort of like racialized description about the High-Qing, and so I think this kind of like sex undertone is what make the unofficial history or the popular fantasies about the Qing monarchy special in comparison with like other popular fantasies about the fallen empire.
Great. We have another question from Peter Perdue, who asks, I heard you mention in passing that Qing imperial expansion is reflected in the series. How is this presented? Does it focus on battle scenes or on landscape or on the encouragement of tourism, for example? Has the focus changed over time? The earlier series on Nurhaci and Kangxi had a lot on battles, as he recalls.
Okay, so okay, let me read the question more.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah. In what series? The imperial expansion is depicted in different ways, like in different series. So for example, in many martial art novels in 1950s and between 1950s and 1980s. So like you will have the presence of a military campaign, and like major battle scenes are not so important because the Chinese martial art novelists would like to highlight that the actual game changers are those super martial art Han martial art masters who can like overcome like the troops and then went to assassin the general or etc. And like in Return of Pearl Princess series, for example, then you do see like a depiction of like battle scenes, because that's like when like hiring extras are very cheap in China, and so they want to showcase like the extension of imperial splendor. And but over time, like when we see like the allegory or the metaphor of imperial expansion resonate in the intimate relationship between different main characters. So they form friendship, and you always have like a foreign or ethnic minority, a princess coming to the court, married to like either the emperor or the or prince, and you can constantly see like how they would then also differentiate who are the closer ethnic minority and who are the like outsiders, such as like Burma, like Russia, and etc. And but more recently, very interestingly, like the more recent Qing period drama, I get the impression that they are avoiding such battle scenes. And so like you see not the imperial expansion, but the ethnic minorities submit to the imperial authority. And some of the sensitive ethnic conflicts in High Qing were consciously avoided in the TV series. For example, in Yongzheng Dynasty, Yongzheng Wangchao, there is no mention of one of the most important minister at the time, Ge Tai, and what he did in the southwest frontier.
So that's really interesting. So that means there isn't much talk of what was the phrase? Qianlong called himself the grand old man of the 10 campaigns, right? There's not much emphasis on that kind of history at all in some ways.
They were mentioned, but they were always at the backdrop.
Right. Integration is much more sort
like a reverse of focus. So they move the main narrative in official history, the military campaign, etc., to the margin, and move the marginal narrative about like romance, personal adventure to the center of the narrative.
Right, great. Okay, so we have another question now on and you can read it too, but I'll read it out for the audience. That takes us to the Republican period. This is an anonymous attendee who asks, for the Republican period, are you mainly going to analyze the narratives presented in stories about Qianlong, or are you going to investigate the reader's opinions, the reception, and responses to stories as you do for contemporary China? If so, where to look for such readers' responses for the Republican era? Thank you.
This is a great question. So I'm still trying to collect readers' opinions and responses to the unofficial histories of Qianlong or of the Qing monarchy, but it's not so easy to find. Most of the readers' responses I found so far are written by like intellectuals in one way or the other. And so their responses are very sophisticated in a way they then, based on those rumors, start serious academic debate regarding like who is Qianlong's actual mother and etc. But in conversation, by observing their conversation with each other, one can get a sense that like by the time many of the core motifs and elements have become common knowledge among educated Chinese readers. But as for like more commoner or semi-illiterate readers, I don't know like how I would be able to collect enough readers' response for the Republic period. But if you know any tips, please let me know, and I would be very appreciative.
Yeah, I mean, reception history is always such a challenge for all of us, I think, especially when it comes to the popular culture in some ways. I was wondering also if you can tell us a little bit more about sort of the political economy behind the production of these shows. So, because you talked about an earlier phase in the late, I guess, the 80s and the early 90s, where you had a lot of money and investment coming in from Hong Kong and Taiwan, and that seems to clearly have changed in more recent years. But what is the relationship between sort of, from a political economy, sort of where the money comes from and where the investment is for these kinds of shows? And is there something distinctive about them vis-a-vis other kinds of, sort of, because the film industry in China has taken off tremendously also in the past few years. So there's clearly different places where this kind of money can be invested. Have you had the chance to sort of get a sense of what that story is?
Okay. Yeah, so I would say that like producing period dramas in China, especially producing Qing period drama in China, it's a highly risk investment in recent years. But you can also see like the emerge of sort of like so you have like two competing forces. One is the for-profit commercial production companies and regional TV stations who see there is this demand, and they would like to fulfill the audience's desire. And on the other hand, you have the National Radio and Television Administrations, who also want to see high quality period drama, but were reluctant to really let it go, like as the market let it go as the market desire. And so oftentimes what happened is that oftentimes what happened in most recent years, about like in the past 10 years, many of the Qing period drama are based on popular online literature first. And so you have different medias, and different medias are subject to different kinds of censorship. And so you can see, like, for example, like 后宫甄嬛传, the Empresses in the Palace, was originally an online film, online fiction based, set in a fictional dynasty, but later was converted into like a story about Yongzheng. And then it also will have to went through various rounds of review, and you can see like those reviews. Those reviews could be seen as a place where these two forces like negotiate with each other. But like the problem of like investing in such like huge like project is that the risk, the major risk is that you never know what the national radio television administration are thinking. Mm-hmm. And so in recent years, there were multiple cases when companies invest millions and millions of money and envisioning there will be a market for it. And then the whole production went in vain because they never got past the authorities review. And so all the money was thrown into water. And after several incidents as such occurred, and you start to see a new wave of self-censorship among the producers. They now were more reluctant to invest like millions of money, rebuild the palace and like make all these lavish costumes. They would then retreat to like a smaller budget and safer topic. And so in this regard, you can say that like the authority did in certain way like manage the situation.
Mm-hmm. Great, very interesting. We have a follow-up question to Peter's actually from Mengjiang again, who says, I personally have found it very awkward that in Zhenhuanjuan, for example, Yongzheng presented himself largely as a Han emperor, so exalting Huaxia, the sort of Chineseness, in front of the Dzungar delegation. Do you think the popular perception of the Qing, as reflected in these dramas, still mostly sees the Qing as a Chinese dynasty, despite the sort of meticulous reproduction of Manchu dress and Manchu rituals?
Yes, my answer is yes. So yes, throughout all this, like in all this TV series and films, and also in in popular fictions as well. Like even though now you have this idea, like even though now you do see like the creators put more effort in recreating or emphasize the Manchu-ness of like the High Qing court, but like the narrative is essentially itself it's a Han-centered narrative. And so in a way you can say part of the uneasiness or part of the tension that early Republic readers encountered is that they were in the process of making Qing emperors Chinese emperor, and instead of like constantly remind themselves that no, they were Manchus.
Okay, we have another question from an anonymous attendee about the what you mentioned at the end about the dramas being taken off. So they ask, are these contemporary dramas that have been removed due to censorship completely unavailable for the Chinese to the Chinese public, or are there illegal versions that continue to circulate in Chinese societies? And by that I mean, I guess they mean the larger sort of Chinese community, globally speaking, not just on the mainland.
Okay, so this like connect back to my first book probably. Yeah, the short answer is yes and yes. So if you try very hard to find illegal websites, you can still access, I think, the full collection of these two dramas. Or alternatively, you can use VPN and visit, like now, interestingly, like you can use VPN and visit YouTube, Netflix, and Amazon Prime because they are available outside of the Chinese market. But a more recent and very interesting development I noticed is that yes, the whole drama, like episode by episode, was not available, but netizens are making short clips and upload them to like highlights of different episodes. and upload them to Weibo or TikTok. So they are still available online for Chinese audience, not as like on the whole, but like the fragments are still available there, and it's impossible for the authority to completely ban it.
So this is very much like the way you can catch all the highlights of the Game of Thrones by going to YouTube. It's sort of very similar, I guess. But so a linked question to the previous one. I'm thinking of sort of the recent popularity of a show like Ertugrul, right, which is about the founding of the Ottoman Empire, a Turkish TV show that's become quite popular globally now, and it's being watched, and that is informing. So maybe originally meant for a Turkish audience, conceptualized for a Turkish audience, but now it's taken on a sort of global appeal, and then is informing a particular globe, sort of informing an understanding of Ottoman history and sort of a Turkish, maybe nationalist narrative in some ways. Is there a similar pattern that is emerging? Is there a wider audience that these shows have been able to create, or is that a part of the attempt even, or is it like how is the audience being conceived of? I guess is the question.
Yeah. So yes, this is like something I'm still trying to figure out because I noticed that there are similar phenomena, or like in Turkey, in Russia, in India, of this kind of revival of like magnificent TV period drama, and accompanied with the rise of a more conservative, like nationalist agenda, and they were mainly made for domestic audience at the beginning. But because of this globalization and also like the various online streaming platforms are like hunger for new content, many of them become available. Many of them become available for a global for global audiences, and so that also caused a very interesting debate in China when these two TV dramas were banned. Because on the one hand, like they were like widely successful in Japan, in Southeast Asia, and are also now available in the United States and elsewhere. And they became the window for foreign audience who are interested in China into what they consider as the authentic Chinese history and the authentic Chinese culture. So some promoter or supporter of such TV drama would say, no, like you see, this is like the expansion of like the pop, like Chinese culture. This is like good for like the soft power of China. But on the other hand, some would argue against such proposal by saying that, but like if what the foreign audience see about China is all about the sabotage, betrayal, and like a bloody like a rivalries, like would they really be attracted by Chinese culture, and what kind of Chinese culture they were learning? And but in terms of this similar phenomena we see in other parts of the world, I'm yet to figure out a way to how to situate the Chinese case and compare the Chinese case with like the Turkish case and the neo-Ottomanism. And yeah, so any suggestion would be very helpful.
There's actually a linked question to the idea of like what conceptions of culture are being presented, or what is the understanding. So another anonymous attendee asks, does the meticulous representation in these dramas of Manchu-ness extend to the Manchu language? So how do these dramas attend to the fact that the Qing was a multilingual empire and multilingual society?
So this is another very interesting phenomena. No, they are not multilingual. So like all this drama were made for modern, mostly Han Chinese audiences. So you do see very peculiarly, like no matter where those people are from, like the Manchus, the Hans, the Mongols, the Korean consorts, the Uyghur, like the Miao people, and even the European Jesuits, they all speak fluent 普通话 and using Chinese phrases. And so yes, like they did try to like present like the multi-ethnic nature of the Qing Empire in a material form. But in terms of the language, it's like it's purely Mandarin. But in comparison, if you watch Korean period drama, it was set like around this a similar period of time, they will see like in those Korean period drama, the Qing officials were actually speaking in Manchu instead of Mandarin. And so actually from the Korean perspective, like Qing was multilingual, but from the Chinese audience perspective, yes, of course, the Qing is not Qing is not multilingual. It's like for them, like they all speak one language, and that's Mandarin Chinese, and they only discuss and comment on the fact that there are Manchu language and Tibetan and Mongolian and etc. But that was never like materialized or presented in a systematic way in most of the period drama.
Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. It leads me to think about sort of, and I'm again basing this off partly to sort of what I'm familiar with has been happening in India with regard to the way in which history is being rewritten. You talked about this sort of rightward shift, sort of a kind of neoconservative moment where nationalism has become important globally. And in that context, a lot of this has to do with rewriting histories, right? So claiming that our history has been incorrectly written and we are going to present a correct version of history. So do you see sort of any kind of link between then this kind of pop culture and more traditional forms of more traditional means of being didactic, so textbooks, the ways in which this history is actually taught? Is there any connection that you see, or not really?
Yeah. Can you repeat your question again?
Yeah. So my question was about sort of the ways in which sort of more textbooks and things like that, the ways in which they are being, in many places, they're being rewritten to accord to this with this more neoconservative sort of usually ethno-nationalist kinds of narratives about the history of the nation, history of the people, and so on. And to the extent that ethno-nationalism has become an important element in recent Chinese politics also. Is there a relationship between that level of social re-engineering and then the kind of more popular culture that you are looking at, sort of, or is it?
Yeah, this is something that I haven't looked into, like very systematically. But one do see this tension between what most people learn from popular histories and those period dramas and novels about like China's past, and the more dogmatic narrative that one finds in textbook or government publications. And so on, like you do see commentaries, especially in places like Zhihu or mostly Zhihu, and some also on Weibo, and also some of the like Weixin 公众号. You do see like this kind of, you do see this attempt from the society or from the grassroots to sort of like question, like it seems that the real history is more juicy, it's juicier and more complicated than what they learned in high school. But like reversely, there is also now I think of it, there is also a reverse conversation that one can find, how those standardized textbook also shaped the popular understanding about the imperial past of China. So like one of the common strategy that if someone travel back in time, if someone travel back to the period Kangxi period, like oftentimes like I won't say 9 out of 10, but like one thing most of the time traveler would do is to find potato and sweet potato and corn. And then there is definitely like an episode of how they promote the usefulness of corn and sweet potato, and that led to the prosperity of the village or the prosperity of the country depends on like their role in the High Qing society after they travel back to that. And you can also see like some of the elements of the so-called like early like the emergence of like early capitalism, like that what they learn in high school textbook will then reiterate in those time traveling stories. There would be, okay, I learned from high school history book that so and so is going to become the emperor, and or like there is this new technique to produce more yam, and so I need then they can recreate that and sort of like in the ideal alternative universe, like in some of the cases, then they speed up the development of China. And so that like decline in later Qianlong era would never occur. And so in a way you can see like that's how the popular culture or the popular narratives were also subject to the logic and the framework of official narrative about the evolution of Chinese history.
That is very interesting. So maybe we have time for a couple more questions. We just have one has come up again that sort of builds on an earlier question, which asks, so Fei-Hsien mentioned that the talk today would probably take up a single book chapter in her new book. I would love to hear more about the kind of case studies and the kinds of sources that she is thinking will make up the other chapters in the book. So maybe if you can tell us one other case story or introduce that.
Okay. Yeah, so like at one point, I was thinking of making the whole book just about the popular fantasies of Qing emperors and empresses. And so if that's the case, then there would be a chapter about Yongzheng, and likely also a chapter about Empress Dowager Cixi. And so, but what we see here is that like a lot of this imperial motifs and themes and grand narrative about Yongzheng and about Qianlong and about Cixi, they were all intertwined. But each of them taking on they have different emphasis. Like for example, that the key word for Qianlong would be prosperity and expansion. The key word for Yongzheng would be suppression and assassination, and also like secret police. And so a lot of the popular fantasies about him was revolved around that. And like Emperor Dowager Cixi, then it would be about mostly like her sexual like scandals, but I'm also thinking of incorporating like cases about Chinese discussion of other people's imperial past. So for example, French Revolution would be one chapter, so like how the discussion of French Revolution helped Chinese to envision in late Qing and post-imperial China. And also this constant comparison between ancient regime and China, like from late Qing to like 10 years ago. it's also like one thing. And like the CC trilogy is one of the other example about like how Austro-Hungarian Empire in comparison with like British Empire and French Empire became the safe empire for Chinese to fall in love with, as well as probably like the more recent surge of tourists in Europe, and particularly like in Britain, and will also be probably a case. But I'm still like deciding what the cases I want to include and what this book would look like. And in terms of materials, so it's like a wide range of materials. I'm familiar with most of the published popular culture products, but now I'm also trying to extend that to merchandise, traveling programs, and many of other things. For example, the piece I published about the Chinese obsession with Empress Elizabeth, like a big proportion of that is analysis of exhibitions and CC thin commodities available for Chinese market. And so it's still very full, and it's still taking into its shape.
Well, it sounds fascinating, and it sounds like it'll be interesting to sort of see an analysis of this sort of wider pop culture, the way it's emerging, and the parallels that you are able to draw. I think so. As you're talking about Elizabeth, I was also thinking about the way in which Henry VIII looms so large in England for the imagination of what England is and the role that he has played, you know, in some ways. So the parallels are quite striking. So we are almost at time now. So I think I should sort of maybe conclude by thanking you and saying that really looking forward to the book. And thank you again for joining us. And thank you to the audience for your great questions and for being here today. And join us in 2 weeks' time to listen to Covell Maiskens. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.